Alex Miller stood in the darkness of his family's garage at 16 m.m., keys trembling in his hands, the engine silent in the night that should have been his last. He'd written the note, he'd said his prayers, but when he turned that key, nothing happened. The old Ford just wheezed and died, leaving him sobbing against the steering wheel, wondering if even his suicide was wrong in God's eyes. 3 years later, sitting at his parents' dinner table with the man he loved just one room away, Alex would realize that broken engine had saved him for this moment. The moment when everything he'd built, everything he'd hidden, everything he'd fought to begin would crumble with 4 simple words. But let's start where all great disasters begin, with hope. Alex had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility. Sunday dinners at the Miller house were choreographed performances where he played the role of dutiful son, discussing Brown's football scores and nodding at Dad's complaints about the Ford plant. His mother would serve pot roasts that stretched across 3 meals, her way of making their paycheck reach further in a town where the American dream felt more like an American maybe. Ryan Rodriguez had been Alex's secret for almost 2 years now. They'd met at Jake's monthly poker game in the cramped apartment above the auto repair shop, where quarters meant more than dollars and everyone brought gas station snacks to share. Alex had noticed Ryan immediately, not just because he was beautiful, with dark eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations, but because he was kind. The way he helped Jake's elderly neighbor carry groceries up the stairs, the way he listened when people talked, really listened, like their words mattered. Their first kiss happened in Jake's garage, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Alex had been terrified, waiting for lightning to strike, for God's judgment to rain down. Instead, he felt something he'd never experienced before. Peace, like coming home to a place he'd never known existed. But peace and small towns don't coexist easily, especially when your last name is carved into the Methodist Church cornerstone and your father's been working the same factory line for 23 years. Ryan understood hiding. His own family carried their secrets like rosaries, prayers whispered in Spanish for a son they loved but couldn't quite understand. He'd learned to duck his head when construction crews made their comments, to smile when his mother asked about nice girls at community college. But with Alex, Ryan could breathe. They could be themselves in stolen moments. In the cab of Ryan's Honda parked by the river, watching stars appear one by one over Ohio cornfields. Alex had tried coming out before. At 13, he'd whispered to his mother about feelings he couldn't name while she folded laundry in the basement. She'd gone pale, then driven him straight to Pastor Williams, who spoke about infection and healing and the importance of prayer. The sessions lasted 6 months. Alex learned to lie so well that even he sometimes forgot the truth. At 16, drowning in self-hatred and scripture verses about abomination, he'd planned his exit from a world that seemed to have no place for him. But the engine wouldn't start. His father's old Ford, reliable as sunrise for 15 years, chose that night to finally give up. Alex sat there until dawn, watching light creep through garage windows, understanding for the first time that maybe surviving was its own kind of miracle. Now, at 25, Alex had built a life that looked normal from the outside. He worked at Thompson Auto Parts, shared an apartment with his roommate Ryan, attended Sunday dinners where his mother asked pointed questions about nice girls and his father grunted approval at appropriate moments. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe, it was sustainable, it was enough. Until the night everything changed. Alex walked into his childhood home that October evening, expecting the usual routine. Mom's famous pot roast, Dad's complaints about management, Chloe scrolling TikTok while half listening to adult conversation. Instead, he found extra place settings on the dining room table and his mother's hands shaking as she arranged flowers that looked suspiciously expensive for their usual budget. Jim Thompson sat at the head of the table like he belonged there, his weathered hands gesturing broadly as he spoke to Alex's father about expansion plans and market opportunities. Beside him sat Daniel, 26 years old and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Daniel's button-down shirt still bore creases from the package, and his eyes kept darting toward the door, like he was calculating escape routes. Alex had known Daniel peripherally for years, the way small towns know their own. He worked in his father's office, lived in his parents' basement, and possessed the kind of desperate politeness that comes from trying too hard to please everyone. But tonight, something felt different, orchestrated, dangerous. Between the pot roast and store-bought apple pie, Alex's father cleared his throat with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. The dining room fell silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. What came next would shatter Alex's carefully constructed world into pieces so small, he wondered if they could ever be reassembled into something resembling a life. But that's a story for hearts brave enough to hear it, because sometimes love doesn't save us. Sometimes love costs us everything we thought we knew about home, family, and the price of being true to who we are. Don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories, where every silence holds a second chance, and every story reminds us that love, in all its forms, is worth fighting for. The truth about that dinner, about Daniel's desperate eyes and his father's sweating palms, about Alex's parents and their impossible choice between their son and their survival, reveals something profound about the weight we carry when we love someone society tells us we shouldn't. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to let fear make our choices for us, even when the cost seems unbearable. The words hung in the October air like smoke from a dying fire. Alex Miller had just spoken his truth at his family's dinner table, and the silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack the foundation of the house he'd grown up in. His father's face shifted through colors Alex had never seen before. Purple anger gave way to something darker, something that looked like grief mixed with rage. When David Miller finally spoke, his voice carried 25 years of disappointment. "You're choosing that Mexican boy over your own blood." The slur hit the room like a physical blow. Alex's mother flinched. Daniel Thompson stared at his untouched pie. Jim Thompson cleared his throat and suddenly found the wallpaper fascinating. But Alex felt something unexpected rising in his chest. Not shame, not fear. Fury. His name is Ryan Rodriguez, and I'm not choosing him over anything. I'm choosing truth over lies. David Miller stood up so fast his chair scraped against hardwood floors that had witnessed 3 generations of family dinners. "No son of mine talks back like that. No son of mine brings this disgrace into my house." "Then I guess you don't have a son." The words escaped before Alex could stop them. His mother made a small sound, like air being let out of a tire. Chloe looked up from her phone for the first time all evening, her face pale with understanding. What happened next moved with the terrible efficiency of a machine built for breaking things. David Miller walked to the front door and held it open. October wind rushed in, carrying the smell of dying leaves and the promise of a harsh winter. "Get out, fix yourself, or don't come back." Alex walked out of that house carrying nothing but his wallet and his car keys. Behind him, his mother wept silently into her napkin while his father stood rigid as a statue, watching his son disappear into the darkness beyond the porch light. Ryan was waiting in his Honda around the corner, engine running, heat blasting against the cold. He took one look at Alex's face and knew everything had gone exactly as they'd feared it would. "Your place or mine?" Ryan asked, trying to keep his voice light. "Yours doesn't exist anymore either." Ryan's parents had discovered their relationship 2 weeks earlier when his little sister found photos on his phone. The confrontation had been swift and devastating. His mother cried for 3 days. His father threatened to call immigration, even though the Rodriguez family had been American citizens for 2 generations. The lies people tell themselves about their children, Ryan learned, can be more powerful than any truth. So they drove. Through streetwire streets Alex had known his entire life. Past the high school where they'd never been allowed to hold hands. Past the church where Alex had learned to hate himself. Past the factory where his father had spent half his life building other people's dreams. They parked at the Walmart on Route 9 and tried to figure out what homeless looked like when you were 25 and in love and had nowhere left to run. The first week taught them lessons no college course could provide. How to shower in truck stop bathrooms, which fast food restaurants would let you sit for hours nursing a single coffee, how to sleep in a Honda Civic without anyone calling the police. Ryan used his community college tuition money to rent them a room at the Sunset Motel, where the manager asked no questions and the weekly rate came with stained carpets and the distant sound of highway traffic. Alex lost his job at Thompson Auto Parts on a Tuesday. The official reason was budget cuts. The real reason arrived in whispered conversations and sideways glances from coworkers who'd known him since high school. By Thursday, word had spread through their small network of friends and acquaintances. Some people chose sides. Others chose silence, which Alex learned was its own kind of choice. Ryan's construction job lasted 3 more days. An accident with a scaffold left him with stitches across his palm and a hospital bill they couldn't pay. The emergency room nurse looked at them with suspicion when Alex tried to sign paperwork as Ryan's partner. "Family only," she said, and Alex felt the familiar sting of invisibility. Jake opened his garage to them during the day, a sanctuary that smelled of motor oil and possibility, where they could pretend they were just 2 guys helping a friend instead of 2 homeless young men whose families had chosen faith over love. Jake never asked questions. He just handed them tools and let them work alongside him, paying them in cash and kindness. Mrs. Patterson, 83 years old and sharp as winter wind, lived next door to the motel. She'd watch them from her kitchen window, noting how they held hands when they thought no one was looking, how they shared everything from cigarettes to hope. One evening, she knocked on their door with a casserole dish and a thermos of coffee. "I buried my husband 47 years ago," she said, studying their faces with eyes that had seen too much history to be shocked by love. "He used to say that family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up when the world gets dark." The casserole lasted 3 days. Her kindness lasted longer. But kindness doesn't pay rent, and hope doesn't fill empty stomachs. By November, Alex and Ryan were rationing meals and counting coins for laundry. Ryan applied for jobs that paid cash daily. Alex donated plasma twice a week, sitting in a chair for an hour while machines extracted what little he had left to give. They learned to navigate systems designed to help people like them, except people like them weren't supposed to exist in small Ohio towns. The food bank required proof of address. The employment office required references from people who no longer wanted their names associated with Alex Miller or Ryan Rodriguez. One night, sitting in their motel room with the heat turned down to save money, Ryan pulled out a notebook and started sketching. His dreams of graphic design seemed impossibly distant now, but his hands still remembered how to create beauty from nothing. He drew their life as it was and their life as it could be, unwinding bridges between here and somewhere better. "We're going to survive this," he told Alex, charcoal smudged on his fingers. "And when we do, we're going to help other people survive it too." Alex watched Ryan draw their future with steady hands and wondered how someone could lose everything and still believe in tomorrow. But that's what love does, he realized. It doesn't shield you from the storm. It gives you someone to weather it with, someone whose faith becomes yours when your own runs out. The human heart, Alex learned during those freezing November nights, is remarkably resilient. It can be broken by words spoken in anger, mended by kindness from strangers, and strengthened by the simple act of choosing love over fear, even when that choice cost you everything you thought you needed to survive. Daniel Thompson swallowed the pills on a Tuesday night in November, 3 days before his engagement party was scheduled to announce his marriage to a man he'd never kissed. The bottle of his mother's anxiety medication sat empty on his nightstand next to a note that simply read, "I'm sorry I couldn't be who you needed me to be." 26 years of trying to fit into a shape that was never meant for him had finally worn him down to nothing. His sister found him 2 hours later, unconscious but breathing. The ambulance ride to County Hospital became the longest journey of Daniel's life, not because of the distance, but because somewhere between the sirens and the oxygen mask, he realized he wanted to live. He just didn't know how. Alex received the call from Jake, who'd heard it from the police scanner at the garage. Despite everything, despite the arranged marriage and the family pressure, and the way Daniel had sat silent during that terrible dinner, Alex found himself rushing to the hospital. Some bonds run deeper than circumstance, deeper than the roles people force us to play. He found Daniel alone in a sterile room, wrists marked with medical tape, eyes hollow with the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting yourself for too long. When Daniel saw Alex, he started crying. Not the dramatic sobs of movies, but the quiet tears of someone who'd finally run out of ways to pretend. "I can't marry you," Daniel whispered, his voice raw from the tube they'd used to pump his stomach. "I can't marry you because I'm gay too." The words hung between them like a confession and an absolution. Alex sat in the plastic visitor's chair and felt the strange relief that comes from discovering you're not alone in your particular kind of pain. Daniel's story spilled out in fragments. 2 years of secret messages with Kyle, a man from Cincinnati he'd met in an online forum for people struggling with faith and sexuality. Video calls hidden in his basement bedroom. Dreams of a life he could never have while living under his father's roof and his father's expectations. "The conversion therapy started when I was 14, Daniel said, staring at the ceiling tiles. 3 years of being told I was broken. 3 years of believing it. Alex understood. The shame that becomes so familiar it feels like home. The way you learn to hate the most essential parts of yourself. The exhaustion of performing normalcy when every breath feels like a lie." But Daniel's near death had cracked something open in the carefully constructed plans of their families. Jim Thompson had arrived at the hospital pale and shaking. Faced with the reality that his business ambitions had nearly cost him his son, Alex's parents came too, drawn by some combination of guilt and genuine concern. In the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital waiting room, with Daniel's life hanging in the balance, the arranged marriage suddenly looked like what it had always been, a desperate attempt to solve adult problems by sacrificing young people's souls. Ryan arrived with coffee for everyone, because that's who he was. He sat with Jim Thompson while the older man cried into his hands, admitting that the auto parts business was failing, that he'd mortgaged everything twice, that he'd been gambling with other people's futures because he was too proud to admit his own failures. "I thought if Daniel married Alex, if our families joined, maybe we could all survive this," Jim said, "I never thought about what it would cost them." The engagement party was scheduled for Saturday. Invitations had been mailed. The venue had been booked. 2 families' financial futures hung in the balance. But Tuesday night in that hospital room, Alex made a decision that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with survival. "Ryan," he said, taking his partner's hand in front of both their families for the first time, "will you marry me?" The proposal wasn't romantic. It was revolutionary. Ryan said yes with tears in his eyes, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. They planned their elopement in 72 hours. Jake provided the transportation and the witness. Mrs. Patterson lent them money for rings from the pawn shop on Main Street. Daniel, released from the hospital against medical advice, contributed his savings, money he'd been hiding from his father for years. The Hamilton County Courthouse in Cincinnati performed weddings on Fridays for couples who could provide proper identification and $50 in fees. Alex wore his only suit, the one he'd bought for job interviews he'd never gotten. Ryan borrowed a tie from Jake that had seen better decades. Judge Martinez, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and calloused hands, looked at them across her desk and seemed to understand something beyond the paperwork. "Love is rare enough in this world," she said. "When you find it, you fight for it." The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. No music, no flowers, no family in attendance. Just 2 young men speaking promises they'd already proven they could keep, witnessed by a friend who believed in second chances and a judge who'd seen enough real love to recognize it when it walked into her courtroom. Jake took photos with his phone, most of them blurry, but one clear shot of Alex and Ryan looking at each other like they'd just discovered fire. They celebrated at a diner down the street, sharing a piece of pie and dreaming out loud about the life they were choosing to build together. The Instagram post went live at sunset. A simple photo with a simple caption, "Today we chose love." The response was immediate and divisive. Hearts and congratulations from friends who'd been waiting for this moment. anger, and threats from people who felt personally attacked by their happiness. Alex's phone exploded with notifications. His mother called from the grocery store parking lot, sobbing so hard other shoppers stopped to check on her. His father's response came through Chloe, who reported that David Miller had thrown his phone against the garage wall hard enough to leave a dent. But Daniel Thompson, still weak from his hospital stay, managed to be the first to comment on their post. "Congratulations. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." That night, in their motel room with the space heater humming and the sounds of highway traffic in the distance, Alex and Ryan held each other as legally married men for the first time. They were still broke. They were still essentially homeless. Their families were still broken. But they had chosen each other, officially and completely. And that choice felt like a revolution. The courage to live authentically doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from desperation, from reaching the point where pretending hurts more than the truth ever could. Sometimes saving yourself means saving someone else first. And sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to let other people's fears determine your fate. The basement of the Miller house had been flooded for 3 days when Chloe called Alex, her voice tight with panic over the phone. Heavy November rains had overwhelmed the old foundation, and water was seeping through cracks that had been ignored for years, just like everything else in that house that needed fixing. Alex and Ryan drove over despite everything, because floods don't respect family feuds. And Chloe was still his sister, even if his parents couldn't look at him without seeing their own failures reflected back. David and Erlinda Miller were at the Methodist Church fundraiser, probably praying for guidance while their basement filled with muddy water and 20 years of carefully stored secrets. Chloe stood in rubber boots in 2 inches of murky water, trying to save photo albums and Christmas decorations, the artifacts of a family that used to exist. Alex waded through the mess toward his father's old filing cabinet, a metal behemoth that had tipped over in the flood, spilling papers across the wet concrete like confessions scattered by wind. Ryan helped him lift it upright while Chloe sorted through soggy documents, trying to save what could be saved. That's when Alex found them. Loan documents bearing Jim Thompson's signature and his father's name as co-signer, dating back almost a decade. Small amounts at first, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, but the amounts grew larger as the dates grew more recent and the red stamps grew more urgent. Final notice, payment overdue, default imminent. The timeline told a story Alex had never suspected. Jim Thompson hadn't just been struggling recently. He'd been drowning financially for years, and David Miller had been throwing him life preservers that were really anchors, dragging both families down into the same dark water that now filled this basement. But the loans were just the beginning. Mixed in with the waterlogged papers were printed emails between David Miller and executives from Midwest Automotive Solutions, a corporate giant based in Detroit. The correspondence stretched back months, negotiations for a buyout that would absorb both the Miller and Thompson operations into something larger and more profitable. The offer was substantial, enough to clear all debts and provide comfortable retirement for both families. But there was a catch, buried in corporate language about succession planning and family stability assurances. The Detroit company would only proceed with the acquisition if they could guarantee long-term family involvement in the business operations. Translation, they needed proof that the next generation would keep the businesses unified. They needed a marriage between Alex Miller and Daniel Thompson to ensure that corporate money wouldn't be wasted on a partnership that might dissolve in family drama. Alex stared at the emails, water dripping from the pages, understanding finally hitting him like a physical blow. His life, his future, his heart, all of it had been collateral in a business deal he'd never been told about. The arranged marriage wasn't about tradition or family values. It was about money, pure and simple. Ryan found the next piece of the puzzle in a folder marked confidential that had somehow stayed partially dry. A draft contract between Jim Thompson and the equipment liquidation company, dated just days before that terrible Sunday dinner. Jim had already started selling off machinery to cover immediate debts, piece by piece dismantling the business he'd spent his life building. David Miller hadn't just co-signed loans, he'd guaranteed them with his own assets, his house, his retirement, Everything he'd worked for since Alex was born. If Jim's business collapsed completely, David would lose it all too. Chloe sat on the basement steps, holding a photo album that had survived the flood, looking at pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings when their family had felt solid and permanent. "They were going to use you to save themselves," she said quietly. "Both families. They were going to sacrifice your happiness to fix their mistakes." The cruel mathematics of it became clear as they sorted through more documents. The Detroit buyout would have provided enough money to clear Jim's debts, secure David's retirement, and establish both families in comfortable, middle-class stability. All it would have cost was Alex's soul and Daniel's sanity. But the plan had one fatal flaw. It required Alex and Daniel to be willing participants in their own erasure. It required them to disappear into marriages that would kill them slowly, quietly, invisibly. The corporate executives had no way of knowing that their carefully structured deal was built on a foundation as unstable as the Miller family basement. They couldn't have predicted that Daniel would choose near death over lifelong pretense, or that Alex would choose love over security. When the marriage didn't happen, when the families imploded instead of uniting, the Detroit company had pulled their offer. The email notification was dated the day after Alex and Ryan's courthouse wedding, a corporate form letter explaining that current circumstances no longer align with our acquisition parameters. Jim Thompson's business collapsed within 2 weeks. The liquidation that had been happening secretly accelerated into a public fire sale. Equipment went to the highest bidders. Employees scattered to other jobs. The building that had housed Thompson Auto Parts for 30 years stood empty, a for lease sign swaying in November wind. David Miller's situation was only slightly better. The co-signed loans still had to be paid, but without the corporate buyout money, he was forced to mortgage his house, sell his truck, and take early retirement from the Ford plant. The comfortable middle-class life he'd built slowly crumbled into something much more precarious. Alex learned all of this through Chloe, who had become the unwilling keeper of family secrets. Their parents couldn't bring themselves to explain how completely their financial security had depended on their son's willingness to live a lie. But the flood that had revealed these secrets also washed away something else. The illusion that family love was unconditional. The myth that parents always wanted what was best for their children. The comfortable belief that personal happiness and family loyalty could coexist without sacrifice. Standing in that flooded basement, surrounded by the soggy evidence of adult failures and corporate greed, Alex felt something unexpected. Not anger, though that would come later. Not sadness, though that was there too. Relief. Relief that he'd chosen truth over comfort. Relief that Daniel had survived long enough to make his own choice. Relief that he and Ryan had built something real on their own terms. Even if it was small and fragile and threatened by forces beyond their control, the water would eventually recede from the Miller basement. The papers would dry out or be thrown away. The insurance adjusters would assess the damage and cut a check that wouldn't cover the real losses. But some truths, once revealed, can never be hidden again. Sometimes the very systems we trust to protect us, whether family or business or community, are the ones that demand the highest price for our belonging. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to be the sacrifice that keeps those systems functioning. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 months after the courthouse wedding that had split their small Ohio town down invisible lines. Alex was restocking inventory at the new auto parts store where he'd found work, a place where his manager didn't care about his personal life as long as he showed up on time and knew the difference between brake pads and alternators. Linda Miller's voice on the phone sounded smaller than he remembered, tentative in a way that suggested she'd practiced this conversation multiple times before dialing. "Your father had a heart attack yesterday. He's stable now, but..." She paused, and Alex could hear the weight of months of silence pressing against her words. "I thought you should know." Alex found Ryan at the community college, sitting in the graphic design lab where he'd managed to re-enroll using financial aid in a work-study program that barely covered the costs but felt like hope given form. They drove to the hospital in Ryan's Honda, the same car that had been their home during those desperate weeks. now reliable transportation towards something that might be forgiveness. David Miller looked smaller in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped reassurance into the sterile air. His face had the gray pallor of a man who'd been carrying too much weight for too long, financial and otherwise. When he saw Alex, something shifted in his expression. Recognition mixing with regret. Linda sat beside the bed, her hands folded in her lap like she was still praying for guidance that hadn't come. She looked up when Alex and Ryan entered, and for the first time in months, she didn't look away. "The doctors say stress was a factor," she said quietly. "All those loans, losing the house payment, early retirement. He's been working 3 part-time jobs since November. The heart attack, it turned out, had been building for months. The same way their family had been breaking for months, piece by piece, until something essential finally gave way under the pressure. But crisis has a way of clarifying what matters. Sitting in that hospital room, watching his father sleep fitfully while connected to machines that measured the rhythm of a heart that had forgotten how to rest, Alex felt something unexpected. Not the anger he'd carried for months, but a deep sadness for all the years they'd wasted being afraid of each other. Ryan left to get coffee, understanding without being asked that some conversations needed to happen in smaller circles. Linda watched him go, then turned to Alex with eyes that held months of unshed tears. "I've been going to meetings," she said. "PFLAG, parents and friends of lesbians and gays. There's a group that meets at the Unitarian Church on Thursday nights." Alex blinked, trying to process this information. His mother, who hadn't missed a Methodist service in 30 years, was attending meetings at a church that most of their neighbors considered barely Christian at all. "I didn't know how to love you and accept you at the same time," Linda continued. "I thought they were different things. The other parents, they taught me they're the same thing." The transformation hadn't been immediate or complete. Linda described months of awkward conversations, of learning new vocabulary, of confronting beliefs she'd held so tightly they'd become part of her identity. She talked about Margaret, whose son had been killed in a hate crime in Columbus, and Tom, whose daughter had been disowned by his entire extended family. "I realized I had a choice," Linda said. "I could lose you slowly, bit by bit, until there was nothing left between us but politeness and holidays. Or I could learn how to love all of you, not just the parts that made me comfortable." David's recovery was slow but steady. The heart attack had forced him into retirement from his part-time jobs, but it had also given him time to think, to process the choices he'd made and the prices other people had paid for them. His first real conversation with Alex happened on a Thursday afternoon when Linda was at her PFLAG meeting. David's voice was still weak, but his words were clearer than they'd been in years. "I co-signed those loans because I thought Jim was family," he said. "But I was willing to trade your happiness for financial security. That makes me a hypocrite and a bad father." The apology didn't fix everything. Years of rejection and religious conditioning couldn't be healed with hospital room conversations. But it was a beginning, a foundation they could build on if they were all willing to do the work. Ryan's presence made those early conversations easier. He brought David sports magazines and helped with insurance paperwork. Small kindnesses that gradually built into something like trust. David learned that Ryan had been sending money to his own parents, who were slowly coming to terms with their son's marriage to another man. Linda discovered that Ryan cooked better than she did and wasn't afraid to say so. By summer, Alex and Ryan had moved into a small house with a backyard big enough for a garden. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, purchased with 2 steady incomes and a loan from Mrs. Patterson, who had become their unofficial grandmother. The Thanksgiving invitation came in October, delivered by Chloe with strict instructions that no one was required to attend, but everyone was welcome if they wanted to try. The dinner was smaller than the old family gatherings. Daniel was there with Kyle, who had moved from Cincinnati after completing his social work degree. Jim Thompson came alone, his wife having filed for divorce after discovering the gambling debts he'd hidden for years. But he was sober now, attending AA meetings in the same church basement. where Linda went to her P-flag meetings? The conversation was careful at first, everyone navigating around the sharp edges of recent history. But gradually, something like normalcy emerged. David asked Ryan about his graphic design business, which was growing through word of mouth and social media marketing. Linda admired the wedding rings that had turned their fingers green, but somehow looked more beautiful for the imperfection. Daniel and Kyle talked about their plans to open a support center for LGBTQ youth in rural areas, using Daniel's inheritance from his grandmother and Kyle's professional training. Jim listened quietly, occasionally offering practical advice about small business management, his voice carrying the weight of hard-learned lessons. The most significant moment came when Linda brought out dessert and produced a photo album Alex hadn't seen before. Pictures from their courthouse wedding, taken by Jake and somehow acquired through the network of friends and chosen family that had sustained them through the darkest months. "I missed your wedding," Linda said simply. "I don't want to miss anything else." The photo went up on the mantle that night, not in the place of honor, but not hidden either. A small step toward a larger acceptance that would take years to fully develop. As they drove home through streets lined with autumn leaves, Alex reflected on the distance they'd traveled, not in miles but in understanding. Their love story wasn't the fairy tale where true love conquers all obstacles through the power of romance alone. It was messier than that, more painful, more real, but it was also more hopeful, because real change happens slowly, in hospital rooms and church basements, and Thursday night meetings where strangers become family. It happens when people choose growth over comfort, when they decide that love is worth the hard work of transformation. 5 years later, Alex would run for city council on a platform of inclusion and economic development. Ryan's design business would employ 6 people and have clients across 3 states. Daniel and Kyle's support center would help hundreds of young people find their way to acceptance and safety. But all of that started with 2 young men choosing truth over security, love over fear, and each other over the easier path of staying hidden. What would you choose if staying safe meant staying silent? Have you ever had to choose between family approval and personal authenticity? These are the questions that define us, the moments when we discover who we really are beneath the expectations others have placed on our shoulders. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more real tales of courage, resilience, and the transformative power of love in all its forms. Because every heart has a story worth telling, and every story has the power to change someone's life.